The town of Redemption, Arizona, was a place built on a foundation of deliberate forgetting. 20 years ago, it had been a raw, violent boom town called Purgatory, a place of mud, blood, and the kind of get-rich-quick fever that burns a town out before it can ever truly live. Then, the silver had played out, the gunfighters had moved on, and the Great Fire of '68 had wiped the slate clean. The handful of families that remained had rebuilt, renaming their town with a hopeful, almost defiant prayer. Redemption. A place for a fresh start. A place where the past was buried. The most powerful man in the new town was Judge Alistair Thorne. He was the law of the bank, the moral compass of the community. He was a man of impeccable reputation, his silver hair and distinguished, handsome features a portrait of civilized authority. He had been the one to lead them out of the ashes of purgatory, and the town owed him its very existence. The peace of redemption was shattered at dusk. A stranger rode into town, a solitary, grim figure on a dust-covered black horse. He was not a young man. His face, lean and weathered, was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. But it was his eyes that held you. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they held the nerving, watchful stillness of a man who has seen the worst of the world and is no longer capable of being surprised. He rode the length of the main street, his gaze sweeping over the neat, respectable storefronts, a look of strange, bitter recognition in his eyes. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his movements stiff but economical. Sheriff Brody, a young, earnest man who had never had to deal with anything more serious than a Saturday night drunk, came out onto the boardwalk, his hand resting self-consciously on the butt of his pistol. "Can I help you, stranger?" he asked, his voice a little too loud, a little too challenging. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He just looked at the young sheriff, his pale eyes seeming to weigh the man's soul. Then he reached into the pocket of his dusty duster and pulled out a small, leather wallet. He flipped it open. Pinned to the inside was a tarnished, five-pointed star, a U.S. Marshal's badge. Sheriff Brody stared at it, a confused frown on his face. The badge was old, of a design that hadn't been used in decades. "I'm looking for a man named Alistair Thorne," the stranger said, his voice a low, rough baritone, like rocks grinding together. "That would be Judge Thorne," Brody corrected him, his chest puffing out slightly. "He's the founder of this town. A great man." "Is that so?" the stranger said, a flicker of something dark and humorless in his eyes. "You tell the judge that Marshal Kane is here to see him." The name meant nothing to the young sheriff. But to the older men who had been in this valley 20 years ago, the men who remembered the town called Purgatory, the name was a ghost, a legend, a whispered piece of bloody folklore. Marshal Jedediah Kane, the hanging marshal, the most feared, most relentless, and most incorruptible lawman the territory had ever known. A man who had been sent to Purgatory 20 years ago to clean it up, and had, according to the official story, died in the Great Fire. A hero who had perished trying to save the very town he had tamed. His badge, they said, had been found in the ashes of the old marshal's office, and had been buried with him in the town's small, quiet cemetery. The stranger standing before Sheriff Brody was wearing that dead man's badge. And he was claiming that dead man's name. The news spread through the town like a prairie fire. A ghost had ridden into redemption. In his opulent, beautifully appointed study, Judge Alistair Thorne received the news from the trembling young sheriff. The judge was in his late 60s, a picture of distinguished, silver-haired dignity. But when he heard the name, Kane, a profound, transformative stillness settled over him. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pale, waxy mask. The confident, benevolent founder of redemption was gone. In his place was a man looking at his own, long-overdue damnation. "Send him in, Brody," the judge said, his voice a low, strained whisper. The stranger, Kane, entered the study. He did not remove his hat. He stood in the center of the room, his dusty, trail-worn figure a stark, brutal contrast to the room's civilized, old-world elegance. The two men, the lawman and the judge, stood facing each other across a 20-year gulf of secrets and lies. "Thorne," Kane said, his voice a low, dead sound. "Kane," the judge replied, his own voice a choked whisper. "I thought we all thought you were dead." "Did you?" Kane said, a slow, terrible smile touching his lips, a smile that did not reach his pale, cold eyes. "You thought wrong." He took a step closer. I've had a long, hard 20 years, Alistair. 20 years in a Mexican prison hellhole, thanks to you. 20 years, dreaming of this day. Dreaming of the day I would come back and ask you about the fire. And about the $500,000 in stolen army gold that disappeared the same night. The foundation of redemption, the foundation of Judge Thorne's respectable, civilized life, had just been shattered. The past was not buried. It had just walked through his door, wearing a dead man's badge, and it had come for a final, bloody, and long overdue reckoning. There in Judge Thorne's study was thick with the ghosts of 2 decades. The 2 men stood locked in a silent, epic battle of wills, the civilized, elegant judge and the brutal, resurrected lawman. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner was a slow, steady countdown to a violent explosion. "I don't know what you're talking about, Hayne," Thorne said, his voice regaining a semblance of its old, authoritative calm. He was a master of control, of projecting an aura of unshakable confidence. "You're dredging up ancient history. A tragedy. The gold was lost in the fire, along with so many good men. We thought, among them." Kane let out a short, harsh, humorless laugh. "Don't lie to me, Alistair. Not now. Not after all this time. Lying was always your greatest talent. You lied to the army. You lied to the territory. You lied to the people of this town. But you can't lie to me. I was there." He took another step closer, his pale blue eyes burning with the intensity of a 20-year-old memory. "I remember, Alistair. I remember it all. I remember you, the ambitious young lawyer, the one who brokered the deal to store the army payroll in the Purgatory SE office. $500,000 in freshly minted double eagles. The biggest payroll the territory had ever seen. The memory was a living, breathing thing in the room, a ghost of fire and betrayal. Purgatory, 1868. The town was a powder keg. A gold strike in the nearby hills had brought a flood of miners, gamblers, and killers. The town was run by a ruthless saloon owner and gang boss named Black Bart Foley. Marshal Jedediah Kane had been sent in to impose the law. For a month, it had been a brutal, bloody, one-man war. Kane had been relentless, incorruptible, a force of nature. He had jailed Foley's men, shut down his crooked games, and had slowly, methodically, broken his grip on the town. The army payroll had been the flashpoint. It was temporarily stored in the massive, stone-walled SE office vault, and Foley, in a last, desperate gamble, decided to take it. He and his entire gang, a force of 30 men, laid siege to the SE office on a hot, dry, windy night. Kane, and the town's only other honest man, a young, idealistic lawyer named Alistair Thorne, and the old, grizzled assayer were trapped inside. The gunfight had been a furious, night-long affair. But Kane was a master strategist. He had deputized Thorne, and together, they had held them off. As the dawn broke, Foley, in his rage and frustration, had made his final, fatal move. He had set fire to the town. The hot, dry wind had fanned the flames, and in an hour, Purgatory was a roaring, unstoppable inferno. "You were the hero that night, Alistair," Kane said, his voice a low, sarcastic growl. "You were the one who said you had a plan. You said you could get us out, get the gold out, through the old, abandoned mine tunnels that ran beneath the SE office. You said you knew a way." Thorne's face was a pale, sweat-slicked mask. "It was chaos, Jedediah. We were lucky to get out with our lives." "Were we?" Kane countered, his eyes narrowing. "I remember the tunnel. I remember you leading the way, me and the old assayer behind you, hauling the heavy gold crates. I remember the fork in the tunnel. You sent us down the left path. You said it was the way to safety, to the creek bed outside of town. You said you would go down the right path, create a diversion, draw them off." He took a final step, and he was now standing inches from the judge, his voice dropping to a deadly, intimate whisper. "But the left path wasn't a path to safety, was it, Alistair? It was a dead end, a place where you had already planted a case of dynamite. I remember the explosion, the tunnel collapsing. I remember waking up in the darkness, buried alive, the old assayer dead beside me, his skull crushed by a falling rock." The story spilled out of him, a torrent of 20 years of buried, festering truth. How he had spent 2 days digging his way out with his bare, bloody hands. How he had emerged into a world that thought he was dead. How he had been found by a band of Mexican bandidos, wounded, half-mad, and without a name. How he had ended up in the living hell of a Mexican prison, forgotten by the world, his life, his name, his very existence, stolen from him. And you, Alistair, Kane finished, his voice a raw, ragged sound of pure, concentrated hatred. You emerged from the other tunnel, a hero. The lone survivor. The man who had bravely fought alongside the legendary Marshal Kane. You told them the gold was lost, buried in the collapsed tunnel. But it wasn't, was it? You had taken it out with you, down the other path. You had planned it all along. The fire was your perfect cover. Foley was your unwitting accomplice. And I was the ghost you needed to legitimize your story. Judge Thorne, his carefully constructed world of lies now in ruins around him, finally broke. The mask of the civilized man fell away, revealing the terrified, cornered rat beneath. Foley would have killed us all, he hissed, his voice a desperate, pleading whisper. It was the only way. I used the gold to rebuild this town, to create a place of law, of order. I did it for them. You did it for you, Kane corrected him, his voice as cold and as final as a gravestone. You built your paradise on a foundation of my bones, and the bones of a good, old man. You built it with stolen blood money. And now the bill has come due. He turned and walked towards the door. I'm not going to kill you, Alistair. That would be too easy. I'm going to do what you did to me. I'm going to take your life away from you, piece by piece. I'm going to show the people of this town the true face of their founding father. I'm going to dig up the past you tried so hard to bury. And then, when you have nothing left, when you are just a man, stripped of all your lies, then we will have our final reckoning. He walked out of the study, leaving Judge Alistair Thorne alone with the ghosts of his own making, a man who had just seen his own, long overdue damnation walk through his door. The town of Redemption became a battlefield, but it was a war fought not with guns, but with whispers. Kane did not go to the sheriff and present his case. He knew that the word of a ghost, a drifter with a dead man's badge, would mean nothing against the 20-year legacy of Judge Alistair Thorne. The judge was the town. His roots ran deep, and twined with every family, every business, every stone and every foundation. To attack the judge was to attack the town itself. So Kane began a different kind of war. A war of truth. He took a room at the town's only hotel, a small, clean establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Gable. He was a quiet, unassuming guest. But he began to talk to people. He started in the saloon, the place that was the true heart of any western town. He did not preach. He did not make accusations. He just sat, and he listened. And he asked quiet, simple questions. He would sit with the old-timers, the men who had been there in the days of purgatory. Men like old Jed, the prospector, or Ben, the blacksmith. I was just a boy then, he would say, his voice a low, contemplative rumble. But I remember the fire. A terrible night. So much was lost. And the old men, their memories stirred by the whiskey and the quiet, intense presence of the stranger, would begin to talk. They spoke of the chaos of that night, of the heroism of the young lawyer Thorne, who had emerged from the flames, the lone survivor of the SE office siege. A miracle, it was, old Jed would say. The whole town was a hell on earth, and he walked out of it without a scratch. And the gold, Kane would ask, his voice casual. A terrible loss for the army. The blacksmith would grumble. Vanished, buried under half a mountain. Or so the story goes. Kane was planting seeds. Small, almost invisible seeds of doubt. He was reminding them of the story, making them re-examine the parts that, in the haze of 20 years, had become smooth, accepted, and questioned legend. His most important target, however, was Sheriff Brody. The young lawman was torn. His duty, his loyalty, was to the judge. But the stranger, Kane, had a presence, an aura of quiet, absolute authority that Brody, as a man of the law, could not help but respect. And there was the matter of the badge. Brody had secretly telegraphed the U.S. Marshal's office in Prescott, asking about a Marshal Jedediah Kane. The answer had come back, cryptic and unsettling. Marshal J. Kane, presumed killed in the Purgatory Fire, 1868. Body never recovered. Case officially closed. The words body never recovered were a hook in the young sheriff's mind. Cain began to work on him, not directly, but by feeding him small, verifiable pieces of the truth. "Ask the judge," he said to Brody one evening, as they sat on the boardwalk outside the jail, "about the sayer. A man named Silas Croft. Ask him what Silas was like. See if his story matches the one in the official report." Brody, his curiosity now a burning fire, did just that. He went to the judge, under the pretense of reviewing old town records. He asked about Silas Croft. The judge described the sayer as a timid, fearful old man who had panicked in the fire. But Cain had already spoken to the blacksmith, who had known Silas well. The blacksmith had described the sayer as a stubborn, cantankerous, and utterly fearless old man, a former prospector who was more afraid of claim jumpers than he was of the devil himself. The stories did not match. It was a small thing, a tiny crack in the foundation of the judge's perfect, 20-year-old story. But it was a crack. And it was enough. Judge Thorne was not idle. He was fighting his own, desperate war. He saw what Cain was doing, and it terrified him. He began a campaign of his own, a campaign to discredit the stranger. He spoke to the town council. He spoke to the preacher. He painted Cain as a dangerous drifter, a con man, a man who was trying to blackmail the town, to tarnish its good name for his own nefarious purposes. He reminded them of all he had done for them, of the prosperity and peace he had brought to redemption. "This man is a ghost from a past we all agreed to bury," he thundered from the pulpit of the church on Sunday. "He seeks to bring the chaos and the violence of purgatory back to our peaceful town. We must stand together and cast him out." The town was dividing. The older families, the ones who had been there from the beginning, stood with the judge. Their loyalty was absolute. Their lives, their fortunes, were all tied to his. But the newer settlers, the ones who had arrived in the last 10 years, were not so sure. They had no memory of the fire, no deep, personal loyalty to the judge. They saw a quiet, powerful stranger who asked uncomfortable questions, and a powerful, wealthy judge who seemed desperate to silence him. The whispers in the dust were growing louder. The past was not just being remembered, it was being relitigated, in the saloon, in the general store, in the quiet conversations of the townspeople. The soul of redemption was at stake. And Cain knew that whispers would not be enough. He needed proof. He needed to dig up the truth, literally. He needed to go back to the source of the 20-year-old lie. He needed to go back to the old, collapsed mine tunnel, the place where he had been left for dead. He needed to find the bones of the man who had been buried there, and the ghosts of the gold that had not. The old assay office was a ghost of a ghost. It was the one structure that had, in part, survived the Great Fire, its thick, stone walls blackened and scarred, but still standing. It was located at the edge of town, and the old district that had never been rebuilt. A place the children called Purgatory's graveyard. The entrance to the mine tunnels beneath it had been sealed with rock and earth 20 years ago, a final, definitive tombstone for the secrets it held. Cain knew that to get to the truth, he had to get into that tunnel. But he also knew that Judge Thorne would be watching his every move. He needed a diversion, and he needed allies. His first ally was an unlikely one, old Jed, the prospector. Jed was a man who lived by a simple, unwritten code. He was loyal to the town, but he was more loyal to the truth. And Cain's quiet, persistent questions had stirred up old, unsettling memories. He remembered the young lawyer Thorne as a man who was perhaps too ambitious, too smooth. He agreed to help. His second ally was Sheriff Brody. The young lawman was now fully caught in a crisis of conscience. The discrepancies in the judge's story, the unsettling telegram from the marshal's office, the sheer, undeniable presence of Cain, it all pointed to a terrible, hidden truth. Brody was a man of the law, and he was beginning to suspect that the biggest criminal in his town was the man who had hired him. The plan was simple and dangerous. Jed, the prospector, was the key. He would start a new gold fever. He rode into the hills and, after a day, returned to town, his eyes wide with a mad, excited gleam. His saddlebags filled with rocks that he had cleverly salted with a few small flakes of gold. "I found it," he roared in the saloon. A new vein, richer than the first. The effect was instantaneous. Redemption, a town that had settled into a quiet, agricultural peace, was suddenly gripped by the old familiar and highly contagious madness of a gold strike. Men dropped their tools, left their farms, and headed for the hills, their eyes filled with the same desperate hope that had built and destroyed Purgatory 20 years ago. The diversion was perfect. The town's attention, and more importantly, the attention of the judge and his loyal men, was now focused on the hills, on the new, phantom gold rush. While the town was distracted, Kane and Sheriff Brody went to work. They rode to the old assy office under the cover of a moonless night, their horses laden with shovels, pickaxes, and lanterns. The work of clearing the collapsed tunnel entrance was back-breaking and dangerous. They toiled in a tense, sweating silence, the only sounds the scrape of their shovels and the soft thud of the earth. "The judge has men," Brody said, his voice a low, nervous whisper as they worked. "A handful of them. Men who are more loyal to his money than to the law. If he finds out what we're doing." "He won't," Kane replied, his voice a grim, steady rumble. "He's too busy protecting his new lie to worry about his old one." After 2 hours of grueling labor, they broke through. A rush of cold, stale air, the breath of a 20-year-old tomb, rushed out to meet them. They lit their lanterns and stepped inside. The tunnel was a narrow, claustrophobic passage, its timbers groaning under the weight of the earth above. They moved forward cautiously, the flickering lantern light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock them. They found the place where the tunnel had collapsed, the place where Kane had been buried alive. And there, amidst the rubble of rock and splintered timber, they found what they were looking for. A human skeleton, its bones yellowed with age, lay half buried in the dirt. It was crushed beneath a massive, fallen support beam. The bones of Silas Croft, the old assayer. Brody's face went pale in the lantern light. "So it's true," he whispered. "He was here." But Kane was looking for something else. He knelt and began to carefully sift through the dirt and the debris around the skeleton. And then he found it. A small, but significant, piece of evidence that would shatter the judge's story completely. It was a single heavy and unmistakable object, a U.S. Army-issue Colt Dragoon pistol, the kind issued to payroll guards. But it was the condition of the pistol that was so damning. The hammer was down, on a spent cap. But the barrel was completely clean, and there was no sign of a fired lead ball anywhere in the surrounding rock or debris. "He was killed before the collapse," Kane said, his voice a low, hard growl. "This gun, it was fired, but it was fired with a blank load. Just powder and cap. Enough to make a sound, to create the illusion of a gunfight, but not enough to leave a bullet. The old man was murdered, executed, and the collapse of the tunnel was just a way to hide the body." The final, brutal piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. Thorne hadn't just been a thief. He had been a cold-blooded murderer. But as they stood in the silence of the tomb, a new, more immediate danger presented itself. They heard a sound from the entrance of the tunnel. The soft crunch of a boot on loose gravel. They were not alone. Their diversion had not worked as well as they had hoped. The judge, a paranoid and cunning animal, had not been completely fooled by the gold rush. He had sent his men not to the hills, but to the one place that held the secret of his entire life. They were trapped, deep in the earth, with the bones of a murdered man, and the judge's killers were now standing at the only way out. The sound of the footsteps at the tunnel entrance was a death knell. Kane and Brody were trapped, 100 feet deep in the earth, their only exit blocked. Kane reacted with the cold, instantaneous calm of a man for whom crisis was a natural state. He extinguished their lantern with a quick, practiced motion, plunging the tunnel into an absolute, suffocating blackness. "How many?" Brody whispered, his voice a tight, panicked sound in the dark. "2." Kane's voice replied, a low, steady rumble beside him. "Maybe 3. Stay here. Don't make a sound." Before Brody could protest, Kane was gone. He didn't make a sound. He simply melted into the blackness, a ghost in his own tomb. Outside, at the mouth of the tunnel, stood 3 men. They were the judge's enforcers, hard-faced men who had been with him for years, their loyalty bought and paid for with the proceeds of the stolen gold. Their leader was a man named Fletcher, a former hired gun with cold, dead eyes and a quiet, professional menace. The judge was right, Fletcher said to his men. "Someone's been digging. Get a torch." One of the men lit a torch, its flickering, greasy flame casting long, grotesque shadows against the rock face. They stepped into the mouth of the tunnel, their pistols drawn. Deep in the darkness, Brody crouched behind the rubble that held Silas Croft's bones, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a good man and honest lawman, but he was not a gunfighter. He was terrified. Kane, however, was in his element. The darkness was his ally. He was not a man anymore. He was a predator, his senses alive and tingling. He could smell the torch smoke. He could hear the soft scuff of their boots. He could feel the subtle shift of the air as they moved deeper into the tunnel. He did not wait for them to come to him. He went to them. He moved with a silent, terrifying speed through the darkness, his feet knowing the uneven ground by a kind of primal instinct. He came upon them from the side, from a small, intersecting passage that he had remembered from 20 years ago. They were moving forward slowly, their torch held high, their attention focused on the main tunnel ahead. They never saw him. He was not using his guns. In the enclosed space of the tunnel, the sound of a gunshot would be deafening, and could potentially trigger another collapse. He was using his knife. He took the man at the rear first, a silent, efficient strike from the darkness. The man let out a single, choked gasp and then crumpled, the torch falling from his hand and extinguishing itself in the damp earth. Fletcher and the remaining man spun around, their eyes wide with a new, superstitious terror. "What was that?" the man whispered. "He's in here," Fletcher hissed, his voice a low, venomous sound. He fired his pistol into the darkness, the roar of the gun a deafening, futile explosion that echoed endlessly in the narrow passage. The muzzle flash, however, was a fatal mistake. For a fraction of a second, it illuminated the entire tunnel, and it gave Kane a perfect, clear picture of their positions. He moved again, a blur of motion in the strobing afterimage of the gunshot. He was not a man anymore. He was a force, a storm of silent, brutal violence. He took the second man, a quick, final encounter in the dark that was over before the man could even scream. Now, only Fletcher was left. He was alone, in the absolute blackness, with a ghost that was methodically, silently, hunting him. He was a hard man, that killer, but his nerve finally broke. "Kane," he screamed, his voice a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. "Show yourself. Face me like a man." He began to back away, firing his pistol wildly into the darkness, his shots a frantic, panicked prayer to a god he didn't believe in. At the far end of the tunnel, Brody listened, his terror slowly being replaced by a kind of awed disbelief. He was listening to a master at work. He was listening to the legend of the hanging marshal come to life. Kane did not answer Fletcher's challenge. He let the man's terror build, let him empty his pistol, let him become completely, utterly unhinged. Then, as Fletcher was fumbling to reload his weapon, his hands shaking uncontrollably, Kane spoke, his voice a low, conversational whisper that seemed to come from right beside him. "You're a long way from home, Fletcher." Fletcher screamed, a high, thin, animal sound, and spun, firing his last, useless shot at the sound of the voice. Kane was not there. He was already behind him. There was a brief, final scuffle in the dark, a low grunt of pain, and then silence. A moment later, a match scraped, and a lantern flared to life. Kane stood there, his face a grim, stony mask in the yellow light. Fletcher lay at his feet, unconscious, but alive. The other two men were not so lucky. "It's done," Kane said to Brody, his voice a low, tired rumble. He looked at the unconscious form of Fletcher. This one will talk. He'll tell us everything. The judge's reign is over." They had come to the tomb to find the bones of a dead man. They had found the truth. But they had also sprung a trap that had now, thanks to the terrible, bloody work of Marshal Jedediah Kane, been turned on its master. The return to redemption was a grim, silent procession. Kane and Sheriff Brody emerged from the mine tunnel into the pre-dawn light, their clothes covered in the dust of a 20-year-old grave. Their prisoner, Fletcher, slung unconscious over the saddle of his own horse. They rode not to the sheriff's office, but to the blacksmith's forge. Ben, the smithy, and old Jed, the prospector, were waiting for them, their faces etched with a sleepless anxiety. They were the core of Kane's small, and now very much committed, band of insurgents. They locked Fletcher in the forge's small, stone-walled storeroom, a place far more secure than the town's flimsy jail cell. Then, in the smoky, firelit confines of the forge, Kane laid out the evidence, the story of the murder of Silas Croft, the proof of the blank-fired pistol, and the testimony he was sure he could extract from their prisoner. "It's enough," Brody said, his voice filled with a new, hard resolve. He was no longer the timid and certain boy who had first confronted Cain. He had been forged into a man in the darkness of the tunnel. "It's enough to get a warrant from a federal judge. Enough to bring him down, by the book." "There's no time for that," Cain countered, his voice a low, grim rumble. "The judge knows his men are gone. He knows we were in that tunnel. He knows we have the truth. He will not wait for a warrant to arrive. He will act. Tonight." Cain knew his adversary. Alistair Thorne was not a man to be cornered without a fight. He was a brilliant, ruthless strategist who had been living a lie for 20 years. He would not let it all be taken away without a final, desperate gambit. "He will try to burn the evidence," Cain surmised, his pale blue eyes distant, his mind already working through the tactical possibilities. "And the evidence is not just what we found in that tunnel. It's me. It's you, Brody. It's anyone who knows the truth. He will try to silence us, all of us, tonight. And he will use the same tool he used 20 years ago. He will use fire." The judge, in his opulent study, was a man possessed. His fear had been burned away, replaced by the cold, clear logic of a cornered animal. Cain was right. His life, his legacy, his entire world was on the verge of collapse. He had only one move left. He had to erase the past and everyone who remembered it. He summoned the last of his loyal men, a core group of a half-dozen hard-faced killers who were more like a private army than a posse. They were men whose own fortunes were tied to the judge's, men who had too much to lose to abandon him now. "Marshal Cain has returned," the judge told them, his voice a calm, chilling whisper. "He has turned the sheriff against me. He is trying to destroy this town, to drag us all back into the bloody mud of purgatory. He is a ghost, and he must be exorcised. Tonight, we will finish the job that was started 20 years ago. We will cleanse this town with fire. We will burn out the disease of the past, and we will start anew." His plan was a thing of terrible, simple brutality. Under the cover of darkness, his men would set a series of fires, creating a wall of flame and chaos at the east end of town. While the townspeople were distracted, fighting the fires, a second team would move to the west, to the blacksmith's forge and the sheriff's office, and they would assassinate the key players, Cain, Brody, and anyone else who stood with them. It was a perfect, diabolical plan. A final, desperate gambit to rewrite history, to burn the last, inconvenient truths from the world. But Cain, a man who had spent 20 years thinking about the mind of Alistair Thorne, had anticipated it all. As dusk fell, a new, tense quiet settled over redemption. But it was not a quiet of peace. It was the quiet of a town holding its breath, a town on the verge of war. Cain and his small, makeshift army were not waiting at the forge. They were hidden, scattered throughout the town, in the darkened windows of the general store, on the roofs of the saloons, in the shadowed alleyways. They had turned the entire town of Redemption into a trap. The first sign of trouble was the smell of smoke, drifting on the night wind from the east. Then, a red, angry glow began to light the sky. The judge's gambit had begun. From the church steeple, where old Jed was acting as a lookout, a single, sharp bell toll rang out, prearranged signal. "They are here." Cain, positioned on the roof of the hotel, his Winchester rifle resting on the parapet, watched as the judge's men, like shadows, began to creep down the main street towards the forge. They were moving into the heart of a killing box they did not even know existed. The judge had planned a fire to cleanse the town, but the ghost of purgatory had planned a different kind of fire. A fire of judgment, a fire of retribution, and the final, bloody battle for the soul of redemption was about to begin. The main street of Redemption, which hours before had been a place of quiet, respectable commerce, was now a moonlit stage set for a war. The angry, red glow from the fires at the east end of town cast long, dancing shadows, turning the familiar storefronts into a landscape of ominous, shifting shapes. The judge's 6 men moved down the street with a quiet, professional confidence. They were hunters, moving in on a cornered prey. They split into 2 groups of 3, one sticking to the shadows of the boardwalk on the north side, the other moving through the alleyways on the south. Their target was the blacksmith's forge, a dark, silent building at the far end of the street. They had no idea that they were the ones being hunted. From his perch on the roof of the hotel, Cain watched them come. He was the conductor of this deadly orchestra, and he was waiting for the perfect moment to begin the symphony. He raised a hand, a silent signal to his men, hidden all around the square. Wait! The first group of thugs reached the front of the general store. They were halfway into the trap. Cain gave the signal. He did not fire a shot. He whistled, a low, soft, two-note call, the sound of a whippoorwill in the night. It was a sound that belonged, a sound that would not alarm. But to his men, it was a command. Now, the world exploded. From the darkened window of the general store, Sheriff Brody's shotgun roared, a deafening, concussive blast that seemed to rip the night in two. The blast of buckshot, fired at close range, caught the three men on the boardwalk in a devastating, shredding wave. One man was thrown backward, dead before he hit the ground. The other two went down, screaming, their bodies mangled. From the roof of the saloon across the street, the blacksmith's heavy buffalo gun boomed, its massive slug taking out one of the men in the alley. The impact of the bullet lifting him from his feet and slamming him into the adobe wall behind him. In the space of 3 seconds, the judge's proud assault force had been cut in half, their confident advance turned into a bloody, chaotic rout. The two surviving men, Fletcher, who had been leading the alley team, and another man, panicked. They began to fire wildly into the darkness, at the muzzle flashes, at the shadows. It was then that Cain opened fire. He was not a shotgun. He was a surgeon. His Winchester cracked, a sharp, flat report that was almost lost in the echoes of the bigger guns. Fletcher, who had been trying to rally his last man, grunted and clutched his shoulder, the bullet spinning him around and taking him out of the fight. The last man, his nerve completely shattered, threw down his rifle and made a desperate, scrambling run back the way he had come. He ran, a single, terrified figure in the empty, moonlit street. No one shot him. They let him go. Cain had wanted a messenger. A single, terrified survivor to carry the news of the utter, catastrophic failure of the judge's gambit back to his master. A new, profound, and ringing silence fell over the main street. The battle, which had been anticipated as a long, bloody siege, was over in less than a minute. The trap had been sprung with a swift, brutal, and devastating efficiency. But the night was not over. The fires at the east end of town were now raging, the flames licking at the night sky. And the judge was still at large. Cain slid down from the roof, his face a grim, stony mask. He met Brody and Ben in the street. "It's the judge," Cain said, his voice a low, hard growl. "He set the fires. He sent his men to die. He's using the chaos to cover his own escape." He knew Alistair Thorne. The judge was not a man to go down with his ship. He was a rat, and the ship was sinking. "The bank," Brody said, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. "His office is at the back of the bank. There's a safe. He'll be cleaning it out, taking the last of the gold. And there's a back alley," Ben, the blacksmith, added, his mind, which knew the layout of every building in this town, working quickly. "It leads straight to the livery. He'll have a fresh horse waiting." The three men, the ghost marshal, the new sheriff, and the righteous blacksmith, began to move, not as a posse, but as a hunting party. They moved through the back alleys of the burning town, three grim, determined figures, their faces lit by the hellish, flickering light of the fires. The battle for redemption was over. The hunt for its soul was about to reach its final, personal, and bloody conclusion. The bank was an island of dark, respectable stone amidst the chaos of the burning town. While the eastern end of redemption was being consumed by the fires he had set, Judge Alistair Thorne was in his opulent back office, a man engaged in a final, frantic act of plunder. He worked with a desperate, feverish haste, his distinguished, handsome features now a mask of sweat and panicked greed. He was stuffing saddlebags with stacks of currency and bags of gold coin from his massive, open safe. This was it. The last of the stolen army payroll, the foundation of his 20-year empire, the blood money that had built this town and his life. He had heard the sudden, brief, and terrifyingly one-sided gunfight from the main street. He knew his men were gone. He knew his gambit had failed. His life in redemption was over. All that was left was flight. A fresh horse was waiting for him at the livery. He could be across the border in Mexico by dawn. He could start again, build a new life, a new lie. He was so consumed by his task that he did not hear the soft, almost inaudible sound of the back door to his office being opened. Cain stepped into the room, a silent, avenging specter, his cold peacemaker a cold, steady weight in his hand. Sheriff Brody and Ben, the blacksmith, flanked him, their own weapons held at the ready. The judge spun around, a cornered rat, a bag of gold coins clutched in his hand. His face, when he saw them, was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "It's over, Alistair," Kane said, his voice a low, dead sound that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. The judge, his mind racing, made a final, desperate play. He was not a gunfighter. His weapon was his tongue. "You can't take me," he hissed, his voice a desperate, pleading whisper. Think of the town, the scandal, to learn that their founding father, their savior, was a thief and a murderer. It would destroy them. It would destroy everything I have built. What you built, Kane countered, his voice as cold and as hard as a gravestone, was a house of lies. And it's time to tear it down. He took a step forward, his pistol never wavering. The judge, seeing that his words had failed, that his power was gone, finally snapped. A wild, insane light entered his eyes. He was not going to be taken. He was not going to a cage. With a final, desperate roar of defiance, he lunged, not at Kane, but at the massive, ornate, mahogany desk that dominated the room. He ripped open a side drawer and pulled out a small, beautifully engraved, silver-plated derringer. His last, hidden resort. He brought the small gun up, a final, futile act of aggression. 3 guns roared in the enclosed space of the office, their reports blending into a single, deafening, final thunderclap. Kane, Brody, and Ben all fired at the same instant. Judge Alistair Thorne was thrown backward, his body a broken, lifeless puppet, his fine, woolen suit suddenly a canvas of dark, spreading crimson. He crashed against the open door of his own safe, and the bags of gold he had been trying to steal spilled out, a shower of golden coins cascading over his dead body, a final, fitting epitaph for a life of greed. A profound, ringing silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackle of the distant fires and the soft, metallic clinking of the coins as they settled around the judge's corpse. The 3 men stood there, their guns smoking, their faces grim in the lamplight. It was over. The 20-year-old lie was dead. The ghost of purgatory had finally, irrevocably, been exorcised. They did not speak. They did not need to. They holstered their weapons. Brody, the young sheriff, looked at the body of the man who had been his mentor, his idol, and his face was a mixture of a profound, disillusioning sadness and a new, hard-won resolve. Ben, the blacksmith, looked at the man who represented the kind of corrupt, civilized evil he had come to this valley to escape, and he felt a quiet, righteous satisfaction. And Kane looked at the body of the man who had stolen his life, the man who had been his friend and his betrayer, and he felt nothing. The fire of his 20-year-old vengeance had burned out, leaving only a vast, empty, and blessedly quiet peace. He turned and walked out of the office, out of the bank, and into the street of the burning town. The past was finally, truly, buried, and now he had to decide what to do with the future. The dawn that broke over redemption was a scene of strange, stark contrasts. At the eastern end of town, the fires, now contained by the frantic, all-night efforts of the townspeople, smoldered and smoked, leaving a blackened, ugly scar. At the western end, the main street was quiet, the bodies of the judge's men a grim testament to the battle that had been fought and won. The townspeople began to emerge from their homes, their faces a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and a dawning, bewildered relief. They gathered in the square, their eyes on the 3 men who stood, grim and silent, before the bank, the ghost marshal, the new sheriff, and the righteous blacksmith. The truth, in all its ugly, brutal detail, was told. Sheriff Brody, his voice clear and steady, a man who had been forged into a true leader in a single night of fire and blood, laid out the story of Judge Thorne's 20-year-old crime. He spoke of the stolen gold, of the murder of Silas Croft, of the betrayal of the man who had been their hero. The people of Redemption listened in a stunned, horrified silence. The foundation of their world, the very story of their town, had just been ripped out from under them. Their savior was a monster. Their peace was a lie. But as the shock began to fade, it was replaced by a different, harder emotion, a quiet, resilient resolve. They were pioneers. They were survivors. They had built this town once from the ashes. They would do it again. They would build it, this time, on a foundation of truth, no matter how ugly that truth was. And what of the ghost who had brought them this terrible, liberating truth? Cain stood apart, a solitary figure, as the townspeople began the slow, difficult work of processing their new reality. His work was done. His vengeance was complete. The ghosts of his past had been laid to rest. And now, he was just a man, a stranger, with no purpose, no destination. He walked to the town cemetery, a small, quiet plot of land on a hill overlooking the town. He found the grave, the one that had been his own for 20 years. The simple wooden headstone read Marshal Jedediah Cain, a hero of purgatory. Died 1868. He stood before it for a long time, a man contemplating his own false legacy. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Sheriff Brody approaching. The young lawman's face was weary, but his eyes were clear. "The town council has met," Brody said. "They've asked me to offer you your old job back. They want to make you the official Marshal of Redemption." He held out the tarnished, five-pointed star, the badge that had been Cain's all along. "They want you to stay." Cain looked at the badge, the symbol of the life that had been stolen from him. He thought of the long, lonely, and bloody trail he had walked. He thought of the man he had been, and the ghost he had become. He slowly, gently, pushed the sheriff's hand away. "No," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "That man, the man who wore that badge, he did die in that fire 20 years ago. He was a man who believed in the law, in the simple lines between right and wrong. The man who came back, he's not that man." He looked out at the town, at the smoke that still rose from the eastern end. "You're the law now, Brody," he said, a note of quiet, profound respect in his voice. "You and these people. You'll build a good town here, a true town." He turned and began to walk away, towards the livery, towards his horse, towards the open, a known trail that was his only true home. "Where will you go?" Brody called after him. Cain stopped, but he did not turn around. He looked out at the vast, empty horizon, a landscape of endless possibility, of endless, lonely miles. "I don't know," he said, his voice a quiet whisper to the wind. "Maybe, somewhere out there, I'll find a piece of the man I was supposed to be." The reckoning of the ghost was complete. He had come back to reclaim his name, his past. But he had discovered, in the end, that some ghosts are not meant to be resurrected. They are meant to be understood, and then, finally, peacefully, laid to rest. Cain rode out of redemption the same way he had ridden in, alone. But he was not the same man. The fire of his 20-year-old vengeance, which had burned with a white-hot intensity and consumed his very soul, was gone. It had been banked and cooled not by blood, but by a final, weary act of mercy. In its place was not a cold emptiness, but a vast, quiet, and unnervingly clean slate. He did not know where he was going, and for the first time in a very long time, that felt not like a curse, but like a kind of terrifying freedom. A man defined by a singular purpose for 2 decades is a prisoner, but a man without any purpose at all is a ghost of a different kind. As he reached the top of the ridge that overlooked the valley, he pulled his horse to a halt. He looked back, one last time, at the town of Redemption. He saw the smoke still rising from the eastern end, a dark scar on the landscape. But he also saw the small, determined figures of the townspeople, already beginning the work of rebuilding, their movements a testament to the stubborn and yielding hope of the frontier. The town would heal. It would grow. It would become the place it was always meant to be, a place built not on a lie, but on the hard, solid bedrock of the truth he had given them. His work here was truly, finally, done. He was about to spur his horse onward, to ride into the sunset and disappear back into the legend from which he had come, when he heard the sound of another rider, approaching from behind. He turned, his hand resting, by old, ingrained habit, on the butt of his Colt. It was Sheriff Brody. The young lawman rode up and stopped beside him. He was not wearing his own shiny badge. He had the old tattered, five-pointed star pinned to his vest. Cain's star. "The town took a vote," Brody said, his voice quiet but firm, carrying a new, hard-won authority. "We're keeping the name, Redemption, but it means something different now. It's not about forgetting the past. It's about atoning for it." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, heavy, canvas sack. "And this," he said, holding it out to Cain, "this is yours. It's not much. It's what was left in the safe after the judge's personal funds were removed. The first deposit in the new Bank of Redemption. We want you to have it." Kane looked at the bag of money, then at the young sheriff's earnest, determined face. The gold. The very poison that had started it all. His first instinct was to refuse it, to cast it aside as the last, cursed remnant of the life he was leaving behind. But then he looked into Brody's eyes and saw that this was not a payment. It was a gesture of respect, a severing of the final tie. He took the bag. Its weight was a familiar, ugly thing. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. Brody nodded, a look of profound, final respect in his eyes. He turned his horse. "Good luck to you, Marshal," he said, using the title as a final, deserved honor. He then rode back down the hill, back to the town that was now his to protect. Kane sat alone on the ridge, the heavy bag of gold resting on his saddle horn, the setting sun a warm, benevolent presence on his face. He was no longer a ghost. He was no longer a legend. He was just a man with a past that he had finally made peace with, and a future that was, for the first time in a very long time, his own to write. That night, he made a cold camp miles from Redemption, in the shelter of a rocky outcrop. The silence of the desert was a different kind of silence now. It was not the watchful, waiting silence of the hunter. It was simply empty. He built a small fire, its lonely flames a small, defiant point of light in the vast, indifferent darkness. He opened the canvas sack. The gold coins gleamed in the firelight, their beauty a terrible lie. They were the price of Silas Croft's life, the cost of his own 20 years in hell, the foundation of a town built on a crime. He could not keep it. To spend it would be to let the judge's poison seep into his own soul. To simply bury it would be a coward's act, another secret left to fester in the earth. He thought of the names he had heard in purgatory, all those years ago. The names of the miners who had been cheated by Foley and Thorne. The names of the small ranchers whose land had been stolen. The family of the old assayer, Silas Croft, who had likely been told their patriarch had died a hero. A new, quiet, and utterly unexpected purpose began to form in his mind. The hunt was not over. It had just changed. His vengeance was sated, but the scales of justice were still imbalanced. He spent the next weeks not writing aimlessly, but with a new, quiet determination. He rode to the territorial capital in Prescott. He spent days in the dusty, quiet archives of the land office and the courthouse, poring over old maps and records from the purgatory days. He was a ghost again, but this time he was not hunting a man. He was hunting memories, piecing together the lives that had been shattered by Thorne's ambition. He made a list of names, a list of families, now scattered to the winds, who had a claim to the gold he now carried. His new trail was not one of retribution, but of restitution. Months later, 100 miles south, a struggling family on a small, failing homestead looked up to see a quiet, gray-eyed stranger ride in. He did not say much. He said he was a representative of an estate, settling an old debt from a mining claim in a town called Purgatory. He left a small, heavy bag of gold coins on their table, enough to buy new seed, new stock, and new future. When they asked his name, he simply touched the brim of his hat and said, "A friend of Silas Croft's," and then he rode away. He did this again, and again. He became a quiet, benevolent phantom, moving through the territory, leaving small pockets of hope and redemption in his wake. He was using the devil's money to do an angel's work, a slow, patient, and anonymous balancing of the scales. One afternoon, he came across a young family whose wagon had broken an axle in the middle of a dry and forgiving plain. He stopped. He did not have the skills of a blacksmith, but he had a strong back and a practical, frontier knowledge. He spent the rest of the day helping the young father, a man with determined eyes and calloused hands, repair the axle. He shared his supper with them that night. They were heading west, to California, their faces filled with the same stubborn hope he had seen in the settlers of Redemption. "You travel in alone?" the young man asked, as they sat by the fire. "Yes," Kane replied. "It's a hard road to walk alone," the man said, looking at his wife and their sleeping child with a deep, quiet love. "It is," Kane agreed, a note of profound, lonely truth in his voice. The next morning, as he was preparing to ride out, he left one of the last bags of gold on the seat of their wagon. The young man tried to refuse. "We can't take this. It's too much. Consider it an investment," Kane said, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "In a new town, a new life. Someone did the same for me once." He rode away, and as he crested the next hill, he looked back. The young family was standing there, watching him go. The man raised a hand in a final, grateful farewell. Kane rode on, the empty saddlebags a testament to his finished task. He was a man with no name, no badge, and no destination. He was just a rider, at sunset. But he was no longer a ghost haunted by the past. He was a man who had, in his own quiet way, bought back his own soul, one good deed, one paid debt, one small act of grace at a time. The trail ahead was still long, and it was still lonely. But for the first time, it was a trail that pointed not towards a memory, but towards a horizon.